Very quickly, I want to tell you about the alphabet. This Joseph character was a genius, an absolute genius. He was in charge of pretty much everything in the land. One of the things he was due to organize was the mining of turquoise in Sinai. And this genius man, who was trained to read the hieroglyphs, write the hieroglyphs, but also being a Semite, came up with something quite extraordinary at a place called Sarabat el-Kadim, which is the main turquoise mine in Sinai, which is up the top of this mountain. I'll do this very quickly. You climb up to the heights in the middle of Sinai, and you arrive at a temple here, right on the top of the mountain. This is the temple of Hathor, who is the lady of turquoise, the goddess of the turquoise mines. These stela are all dedicated to her, and they have Semitic names on them of the workforce that was sent here to mine the turquoise. Here is Hathor, the goddess with the strange wig and the eyes, and she's called Hathor. And here we have Meket Mofkat, which is the lady of turquoise, which is her title. Here is one of the mines where they excavated the turquoise, and what Petrie found, Flinders Petrie found in here, was quite remarkable. He found a script carved on the mine face, and it's clearly hieroglyphics, but nobody could read it. It didn't read Egyptian. So Petrie was scratching his head and couldn't work it out, and then Sir Alan Gardner came along and worked out what was going on here, and he realized that it was actually Hebrew, but written in hieroglyphs. And it's called proto-Sinaitic. So here is your Hebrew alphabet with the earliest form of writing. So what happens, for instance, I'll give you an example here. The water sign in Egyptian hieroglyphs is the word for nu, water, but in Hebrew it's mayim. So that becomes the letter M. The house, beit, Egyptian pear. Okay, so brilliantly, he takes Egyptian hieroglyphic signs, he actually gives the Hebrew name to them, and the first letter of the Hebrew name becomes the letter of the alphabet. And it can go all the way through the alphabet, right the way down to Tav, which of course is the cross. And this one over here, Aleph, which is the ox. Let me give you an inscription from there, which you can read just about if I highlight it. This says, Mem Aleph Ayin Mem. It's a very crude form of the word mayim, and that is a leather water bag. Water. Let's look at the letter Aleph just to show you how that evolves into the modern alphabet. Here is our modern letter A. You can do this with all the letters of our alphabet. This is it in Phoenician, rotated 90 degrees with the cross member breaking through the diagonals. And this is it in proto-Sinaitic from this particular cave. And if I now put the details in, it's an ox, Aleph. So we get our modern alphabet through proto-Sinaitic, through Proto-Canaanite Hebrew, through Phoenician, through Greek to our modern alphabet. That's all down to Joseph. Joseph gave us our alphabet.
And the reason why you believe it's Joseph, why do you think that that's the case?
It requires it to be a Semite with a superb education, who was an administrator, who could write in hieroglyphs, but wanted to develop a script for writing Hebrew. Now, I would have originally thought of Moses, but we now find that these inscriptions are dated to the late 12th dynasty, which is before Moses. So it has to be somebody else. And the only person I can think of who capable of doing that was the man who was the most important official in the land of the pharaohs, the vizier, capable of doing all this, who was a Semite, who lived in that palace in the eastern delta. It's logical to assume that it must be Joseph who did this. So I'll get on to Moses very quickly. Who was the Pharaoh who raised Moses in the palace? So here's the text, famous one from Exodus 1. Then there came to power in Egypt a new king who did not know Joseph. Joseph had died. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites are now more numerous and stronger than we are because they've prospered. We must take action to stop them from multiplying. Or if war should break out, they might join forces with our enemies. They might take up arms against us and then escape from the country. Accordingly, they put taskmasters over the Israelites to wear them down by forced labor. This is the introduction to Moses and his birth. They've prospered, they've got numerous, they've become powerful, and we've seen that because in the 13th dynasty, most of the officials were Semitic. They weren't Egyptians. In fact, even some of the pharaohs were Semitic at that time. One of the most telling and saddest things about the archaeological excavations at Tel Adaba Avaris is they found hundreds of tiny graves. These are mud bricks here, so that's a little baby. All over the site. Now, in most ancient sites, infant burials represent around 25% of the cemetery population. In other words, 1/4 of most graves you find in the ancient world belong to infants, 1 year old or less. In this site at Avaris, infant burials represent 50% of the total cemetery population. There is a massive doubling of the number of infant burials. And then, with the remaining adult population that are left over, of the remaining adult burials, there are 3 females to every 2 males. That tells me that these infants are mostly male, because there's a skew in the population. These slaves go from being 50-50 male and female to a strong bias towards female in adulthood. And we know what that story is. Now, there is a writer, a Jewish historian called Artaparnos of probably Iranian extraction. We believe he might have been from Persia. And he actually wrote a history of the Jews for the Greek pharaohs, the Ptolemies. And his history was placed in the Alexandrian Library. Then, of course, later on the Christians came along and burnt it to the ground, and we lost his original manuscript. We've never been able to recover that. However, other people, other scholars, quoted from him extracts from his history of the Jews. And he tells us the Pharaoh who raised Moses in the palace. Even though the Bible just says Pharaoh, he names him. Now remember, he's writing in Greek for his Greek masters, the Greek pharaohs, the Ptolemies. This is what he calls the Pharaoh who raised Moses. Chenofres. 3 elements. Chenofres. We can translate that back into Egyptian as Cha-Nefer-Re, or Cha-Nofre. That is the name of just 2 kings of ancient Egypt. One in the Old Kingdom, which doesn't count, and this guy. Cha-Nefer-Re Sobekotep IV is one of only 2 kings in the entire history of Egypt with this prenomen. In other words, the coronation name. So this is the name Artaparnos gives to the pharaoh, and we can identify him with this king called Sobekotep IV. Here he is. He's the most powerful pharaoh of the dynasty, the 13th dynasty. Here are statues of him from Karnak. He is the 29th ruler of the 13th dynasty. I'm very quickly going to show you his position. But he probably had a summer palace like this one at Avaris, where he would have met, or Moses would have been raised, and then perhaps in the confrontations of the Exodus, this had been the place where those confrontations would have taken place. If you look at the site again from a different angle, you can imagine, here's Pharaoh's palace and the temple. You can imagine the princess bathing in the water here, or coming out to bathe in the water here. And down here, the baby Moses being placed in his basket, and then the water taking him towards the palace where he would have been found by Pharaoh's daughter. When you get the archaeological evidence, you can start to see the story evolving and working. So Moses was then raised in the palace of Chenofres. He would have been an educated man, learning hieroglyphs, etc. Here we see a fragment of the Royal Canon of Turin, which is a king's list of the pharaohs. And here we get this last sub-dynasty that enslaved the Israelites. Sobekotep III, we have a Brooklyn papyrus with slave lists with Semitic names in there. And then we have Neferhotep, a very powerful king, and Sobekotep IV, who was the one who was the stepfather rather, of Moses. When he died, there's the start of the 13th dynasty. When he died at the bottom of the papyrus, the 29th king, we come to the next column over here. We need to be looking for the Pharaoh of the Exodus. So if I go 45 years down, it's approximately 45 because we don't have the exact dates, we come to this little fragment of the papyrus here and the name Dudimose. Remember that name, because he's the Pharaoh of the Exodus, not Ramesses II. This nobody, this guy who nobody's ever heard of. He's virtually the last king of the 13th dynasty. And it's his time when this happens, according to Manetho. Have you heard of Manetho? He's the Egyptian priest who wrote a history of the Egyptians, who mentions, quoted in Josephus, who mentions this. And this is quite striking. In the time of a king called Ptolemaeus, remember he's writing in Greek again for the Ptolemies. Ptolemaeus is Dudimos. In his reign, for what cause I know not, a blast of God smote us. And God here is in the singular. You would expect an Egyptian to be writing, and the gods smote us. But he doesn't. He refers to one God smiting the Egyptians. And he continues, and Kai in Greek, which means what follows on from God smiting. Unexpectedly, from the regions of the east across the Sinai, invaders of obscure race marched in confidence of victory against our land. By main force, they easily seized it without striking a blow. And having overpowered the rulers of the land, they then burned our cities ruthlessly, razed to the ground the temples of the gods, and treated all the natives with cruel hostility, massacring some and leading into slavery the wives and children of others. That is the punishment of Egypt. That is post-Exodus, the invasion of the Hyksos, coming into Egypt, being able to take over the land without striking a blow. There is no army to defend Egypt. Why? It's at the bottom of the sea. Otherwise, Egypt would have been defended by the army. And at this very moment, at the city of Avaris, Tel Edaba, in stratum G1, the Austrians came across scores of pits in the ground, shallow pits, with bodies thrown in on top of each other. Look how this guy's leg lies across this guy's chest. This one is flat on his back. That one's on his stomach. Here's another example. This guy has just literally been tossed into the grave and his arms fallen forward. Betak, the excavator, says what happened in Egypt at this moment was a terrible plague struck the place. And the people died. And they had to bury them in emergency burials for fear of contamination of the survivors. And right afterwards, the entire Asiatic quarter of the city vanished. They simply closed their doors and they left. And for a period, we're not too sure how long, maybe 5 years, 6 years, the place was left to the drifting sand. And then in came the Hyksos and occupied the site and completely bulldozed it flat and built a mortuary cult on top of this site, where they buried the Hyksos kings. At the end of stratum G, marking the end of the 13th dynasty, the main Tel area was abruptly abandoned and the Semitic population vanished. So here we are. This is the location now we're dealing with. We're not saying Ramesses in the 19th dynasty was the Pharaoh of the Exodus. We're saying it happened down there under Dudimos at the close of the 13th dynasty. And this, 40 years later, or approximately 40 years later, is when we should be looking for a Jericho that was destroyed. And then we have the Egyptian collapse with the Hyksos dominating the country for 2 centuries before the recovery in the 18th dynasty. So, we're not going to deal with where they went, because that's for the next film. So I'm going to very quickly jump forward to the conquest.